Hello and welcome. My name is Kyle Ferrier. I'm a fellow and director of academic affairs at KEI, and I'll also be the moderator for today's event. We're here today to discuss a new narrative that has emerged on the Korean Peninsula. As we all know, North Korea over the past few years, especially under Kim Jong-un, has increased its missile testing, as well as shown advances in technological development. But last year, we started to see a new narrative emerge based around the timing of tests on both sides of the Korean Peninsula, that there was a new arms race emerging on the Korean Peninsula. However, if you dive deeper into what's driving South Korea's military buildup, the answer is not so simple as South Korea's military buildup is being driven by North Korea. So our two speakers today have co-authored a paper for KEI examining broader forces behind South Korea's military force development, and in doing so, try to debunk the arms race paradigm. And we're very fortunate to have with us discussant, a burgeoning young scholar, to offer her thoughts on the paper and on the argument. So first up, we have our two authors. Markus Garlauskas is a non-resident senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security within the Atlantic Council, and is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Security Studies program. Markus served in the U.S. government for nearly 20 years, including serving as the National Intelligence Officer for North Korea on the National Intelligence Council, through which he led the U.S. intelligence community's strategic analysis of North Korea and expanded analytic outreach to non-government experts. His co-author is Axel Catellier. He is a senior research analyst and executive assistant for Mr. Markus Garlauskas and the vice president of the Sejong Society of Washington, D.C. He previously interned with the U.S. Department of State in the Wilson Center and very recently earned an MA in Asian Studies from Georgetown University. Next up, we have our discussant today, Lami Kim, who is an assistant professor in the Department of National Security Studies, the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. She also serves as a U.S. Korea Next Gen scholar, as well as a security and statecraft fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Mansfield Luce Asia scholar, and an adjunct fellow at Pacific Forum. So I'll turn things over now to Markus and Axel to get us started.
All right. Thanks for this wonderful opportunity, Kyle. Over to you, Axel.
Yep. So I want to just start off by thanking KEI for providing us with this opportunity to write this paper. And Kyle, especially to you for being with us every step of the way. Dr. Kim, thanks for joining us, especially on such a short notice. We really appreciate it. And I'm truly looking forward to our discussion following our presentation. And then lastly, thank you, Mr. Garlauskas, for working on this paper with me. It's been absolutely incredible to work with someone with such deep expertise and knowledge. So with that said, I'm going to jump right into it. But Mr. Garlauskas, do you want to say anything before I get started?
Yeah, just a few opening thoughts. I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity here, not just to be able to do the paper and give this presentation, but the fact that we have the ability to have a more established analyst be able to engage and have an event with analysts that represent a rising generation. And so I really think this is important for the Korea field because so much is changing so quickly that we need to be able to keep up with and get ahead of those changes and really develop rising scholars, rising experts, and pass on some of the observations and lessons of the history of the Korean Peninsula and how these issues have evolved, but also be able to really look forward to where things are headed with again a new generation of expertise. So I also want to emphasize that a lot of what I'm going to say today is informed by my experience in the U.S. government, particularly the 12 years I spent on Peninsula at U.S. Forces Korea Combined Forces Command and United Nations Command. But that I'm purely speaking for myself here. None of my past or current affiliations views are being represented in my comments, and I think some of the things that I'm going to say actually probably are directly opposed to some of those positions, because I think we're trying to provoke some thought and really drive some analysis in a different direction to move beyond sort of some of the historical paradigms of how we viewed things. So again, thanks to everyone involved, and particularly to Axel and to Lami for participating in the discussion and adding so much value.
All right, so jumping right into it, as Kyle said, this paper stemmed from our observation that there have been quite a few uncritical assertions, often in the media, as you can see here, about an escalating and worrisome arms race between North and South Korea. And that these assertions have frequently ignored several of the broader factors influencing South Korean military force development in favor of an exclusive focus on the threat from North Korea. And this was especially the case in September 2021, when the ROC tested an SLBM several days after North Korea tested 2 SRBMs and a cruise missile. And then also earlier this year, when North Korea resumed intercontinental ballistic missile testing after a pause since 2017, after which South Korea launched its own missiles and conducted its first test of a space launch using a solid propellant. So what the arms race argument misses is that the development of these systems took place or started long before North Korea resumed ICBM testing, and other factors are relevant here. With that said, I do want to caveat that we are not trying to dismiss or downplay the threat from North Korea or argue that South Korea is or should do so. Instead, we're asserting that there is more at play for South Korea than its northern neighbor, and that the capabilities the ROC is acquiring and developing provide opportunities for the ROC-US alliance. So with that said, we approach this paper through a series of questions that seek to translate the broad strategic goals of the ROC into specific military hardware being acquired. And as a note, by demands, as you can see here on the third question, we mean, what does the ROC government want or need its military to be able to do in the future, given its available resources and these broader considerations? So I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Garlauskas, and he'll briefly introduce the broader considerations that we identified, and then we'll turn to how this affects ROC strategic thinking on defense investment, and then sort of match these demands that we identify in our paper with a few examples of specific defense acquisitions.
So thanks, Axel. There's a lot of different factors that I've seen personally, and I think that we can derive through research that drive the acquisitions and the force development of the ROK military. And the usual focus in these conversations is on the threats from North Korea, changes in North Korean capability as being the primary drivers. And I would argue for a pretty good period of the history of the ROK military, that was probably a very appropriate overriding focus. But I think in how we approach this, we have to, as we've talked about, examine a much broader range of considerations, and also examine the context of how the North Korean threat fits into South Korean thinking on national security issues, and how it fits into the role of the South Korean military. And I think particularly the rising potential for the U.S. military to be committed elsewhere and have limited limitations, at least on its capability to contribute to the defense of the Republic of Korea, is an important piece of context. So it's not just evolution in the North Korean threat in isolation, it's evolution of the North Korean threat in context of how other capabilities and other factors play in. And so you can use that, though, as a bridge, I think, to think about a broader set of dynamics that even go well beyond North Korea. So as we developed the paper, we looked at the larger contextual aspects of what informs ROK thinking about national security issues, and then most likely also decisions on military acquisitions. And so we highlight here on the slide a few of the examples of historical background, and I think any conversation about the ROK national security priorities is going to bring up the concept of the shrimp among whales, right? The idea that South Korea and the Korean Peninsula in general is often caught between larger powers, right? This is something that's really part of the strategic DNA, so to speak, of South Korea. I think particularly the growing competition between the United States and China in East Asia, both in a broader sense, but also coming down to the potential for a military conflict between the U.S. and China. I think that really is having an increasing effect on ROK strategic thinking and on thinking about force development and acquisition. And then you look at the ROK-US alliance. That's another major factor, and particularly how the alliance is evolving, right? And one of the key aspects that affects the acquisition decisions is the bilaterally agreed requirements for OPCON transition, referred to by abbreviation as the COTP process. And that actually, I think, was very well explored by Lamy in her piece, A Hawkish Dove, published in War on the Rocks, that actually got me thinking about some of these issues, and it came up very early in our discussions on this. And that, of course, is a key factor. The agreement to develop particular capabilities between the ROK and the U.S. Has definitely had an impact on ROK thinking about acquisitions. But another one I think that's often underestimated, but really looms large, is domestic considerations, right? We highlight a few here. The idea that the ROK in part makes decisions based on what's going to be good for domestic investment in what's going to grow the economy, drive the development of technologies within that are applicable to the civil sector. What's going to allow the ROK to be able to export arms, both for the benefit of the ROK economy, but also to help with the ROK's strategic position in the world, and to foster stronger security relationships with countries to which it can export arms. But then another big factor, and I'll leave it at this one, is the demographic considerations. And Axel's going to touch on these in later part of the presentation. But the fact that the ROK is going to have such a shrinking population of people who are eligible for the draft to be conscripts is going to have really significant effects on the size of the ROK military, the structure of the military, and the types of capabilities and equipment, and what the order of battle of the ROK military is going to look like. And so I think that's a very significant consideration that's always in the background whenever you're looking at the ROK military, particularly, of course, at the ROK Army, which will be disproportionately affected by that consideration. So we could give an entire presentation just about these issues, but I think this gives you the context of how we approach this. And so now I'll let Axel take the presentation back and go into some more depth here. So over to you, Axel.
Awesome, thank you. So we looked at the last decade of ROK defense white papers, which are released every couple of years and resulting in 2 to 3 reports per administration. And we looked specifically in how these defense white papers described South Korea's general security environment, and then also the security environment in Northeast Asia. And probably to a little surprise to anyone watching this, these defense white papers have consistently described a very dangerous security environment surrounding the ROK. And both progressive and conservative administrations have identified either a regional arms race or sort of like threats from all directions. Now, under the Moon administration, there was a huge emphasis in particular on omnidirectional threats. And this term appears both in strategic documents like these defense white papers and in official descriptions about why specific military systems are being developed or acquired. However, like previous administrations, the only country specifically identified as a driver of these defense preparations was North Korea. And rather than contradicting the premise of our paper, we believe that this omission is designed to avoid antagonizing and drawing criticism from both foreign and domestic audiences. And by that, I mean that explicitly identifying China, Russia, or even Japan as justifications for defense programs would create unnecessary political risk when North Korea is frankly very easy to blame. And so the broader drivers of South Korea's defense acquisitions and spending become clear when you instead look at the demands being placed on the ROK military, as I mentioned earlier, and then also the specific acquisitions being made. So with that in mind, in the course of our research, we identified 4 demands being placed on the ROK military. In the explanations you can see here on the right, you could directly see the impact of the broader drivers Mr. Garlauskas just introduced. And if there was a bilateral arms race with North Korea, we would probably expect to see two things. First, that the demands being placed on the military were very reactive rather than proactive. And secondly, that the demands are or would be more requirement-based rather than resource-driven. In actuality, these demands are relatively proactive, they're future-oriented, and they indicate that the ROC is investing what resources it can reasonably commit given its domestic context and the drivers we just identified. So what we could do is we could take these demands and we could put them up against specific defense acquisitions. In our paper, we analyzed 4 different categories of defense acquisitions: ballistic and cruise missiles, naval assets, missile defense capabilities, and surveillance, reconnaissance, and satellite capabilities. But for brevity's sake, we're not going to go into all the capabilities we looked at in our paper, and so we chose to display 4 specific assets during this presentation. Now, starting on the left with the CVX class or light aircraft carrier, the light aircraft carrier would fulfill all 4 of the demands that we identified and is at the same time clearly not the most cost-effective means of deterring and defending against North Korea. Now, I should note that the Yoon administration's Minister of National Defense has expressed reservations about this program, and the Chief of Naval Operations, who was pro-development of an aircraft carrier, has been dismissed. So it's possible that this program is on the ropes. But for the sake of an example, proponents of this program argue that it would provide deterrence against regional powers, meaning that first demand, it would form the flagship of a blue water navy. Reduced personnel would be achieved through high levels of automation. And lastly, it would provide additional capabilities that can operate alongside the United States, but also independently. Similarly, other acquisitions like the developmental Hyunwoo 3D 4-land attack cruise missile and the recently tested LSAM interceptor would meet many, but not all, of the demands that we identified in this paper. Notably, for instance, the Hyunwoo would have a potential range of up to 3,000 kilometers, which stretches far beyond the Korean Peninsula. So with these acquisitions in mind, and I do encourage you to read the full paper so you can see our other ones as well, what recommendations would we offer for the ROC-US alliance? Back to you, Mr. Garlauskas.
I'll be brief here. So overall, the key insight I think that comes out of this conversation is the value of embracing rather than fighting the paradigm of looking at ROK capabilities that extend beyond just what's required to deal with North Korea. And I think what I've seen has been often, I think, unfair and perhaps unwarranted frustration on the part of some U.S. officials with the fact that the ROK has priorities other than just meeting what's required under the COTP or what's required to be prepared for a war with North Korea. I think the obvious utility of having capabilities other than just those necessary to deal with North Korea, in terms of larger goals for the ROK-US alliance is really key potentially to being able to move forward in a broader alliance approach that looks at the global and regional aspects of the alliance. And so I think a mechanism, a format that would allow for these sorts of discussions, again, not necessarily getting rid of COTP, but having conversations about force development that are not just within the COTP framework, I think is key, not just tied to OPCON transition or the North Korea threat. And that could be done through the mechanism within the existing Korea Defense Dialogue. You do it as part of the Security Consultative meeting, for example. You don't need to create a whole new structure, but I think there's a way to adjust a little bit to allow those conversations to move forward. A second point, and this is a recommendation primarily for Seoul rather than for Washington, is to be more transparent about the cost benefit of military acquisitions and not just transparent internally within the domestic audience, but be more transparent with Washington. There are issues that are of pretty significant concern, understandably, like interoperability. That often end up taking a backseat to other considerations, and it's not always transparent, I would argue, to Washington or domestically within the ROK about the cost that is being paid to emphasize some other aspect or some other priority. And so I think a great example is when the ROK chooses to produce a domestic system that's been developed in such a way to maximize the export ability of that system, right? And that often means then not using certain U.S. technologies or certain things that would be inoperable with U.S. systems to make it easier to export, because then, of course, the U.S. doesn't have to be part of the process, and the U.S. wouldn't have concerns about its technologies, being shared. And so that helps, with one aspect. But if that capability is going to be used in a multinational operation that's going to involve, a U.S.-led operation, or where the U.S. and U.S. standards are going to be, or even NATO standards are going to be used, that could be a real big drawback. And so I think being more honest about these trade-offs and more open about them, it'd be politically sensitive, but I think this will really help the decision-making process, and then help avoid these uncomfortable situations where the U.S. is concerned about some aspect of, okay, why is this acquisition going in a different direction, in a way that would be not aligning with what the U.S. is looking for, and then also again to help with the domestic considerations of really I think more appropriately weighing which is more important in this situation. And then lastly, the capability development allows for, I think, a more proactive, forward-leading approach to thinking about the military aspect of the alliance beyond just North Korea. And so as these capabilities are being developed that have implications well beyond the Korean Peninsula, then there should be military planning and exercises, and not just very closely held behind closed doors, but much more open about, we are going to practice and prepare and plan for things other than just protecting the ROK from a North Korean attack. And I'm not saying that I expect then next year the ROK and the U.S. are going to do an exercise about how the U.S. and the ROK are going to support the defense of Taiwan, right? I mean, that's perhaps way in the future, right? And maybe that's a goal to work toward. And I think it's one that may be appropriate. But in the near term, thinking about how to deal with things like Chinese incursions near Jeju-do, or in the West Sea, the Yellow Sea, or potential Chinese involvement in a crisis in and around the Northwest Islands. As an example, something having to do with Russian activity off the east coast of South Korea. And of course, Russian aircraft have done sometimes some significant activities out there as well that the ROK has responded to. So I think thinking about more broadly how the ROK and U.S. militaries can work together in areas beyond the Korean Peninsula, as to be fair, they have in the past, I think would be a real great way to take advantage of the fact that ROK has priorities other than just preparing for its military for a fight with North Korea. And to be fair, to deter North Korea. So I think this can all fit within a larger approach that still embraces the capabilities necessary to proceed with OPCON transition and to reinforce deterrence, which is vital as North Korea's capabilities improve. All right, back to you, Axel.
Yeah, I just want to wrap up by saying that perhaps a little selfishly, that this paper comes at a good time, that President Yoon and President Biden have committed to an expanded vision of the alliance, and in the recently released joint statement, they've committed to expanding discussions on expanding the scope and scale of combined exercises and training. And so this is a good time for these recommendations to be implemented, and an opportune time to integrate these new ROC capabilities that we've identified in this paper in ways that will make both Northeast Asia and the world a safer place. And clearly, President Yoon and President Biden are thinking about this too, as you could see on the quote on your screen. But I'll wrap up there, and I look forward to your discussions from the audience, and then also Kyle and Dr. Kim's.
Thank you both, Markus and Axel. That was great. Very concise overview of your paper. And as Axel, you alluded to, I would highly encourage people out there listening in now to go to our website, keia.org, and check out their paper for a deeper dive into some of the things that they've been alluding to here. But like I said, a very good overview of the key points of the paper, which now Lami will actually have an opportunity to comment on. So I'll turn things over to her now.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kyle. I'd like to thank KIA for giving me this excellent opportunity to read and discuss really important and timely paper. And so first of all, I'd like to congratulate the authors on publishing this paper. I'll provide a few thoughts. I don't really have a lot of criticisms and disagreements. But before I do that, I should mention that the views expressed here do not necessarily represent the official policy of the US government. So I absolutely agree that South Korea's recent military buildup shouldn't be solely attributed to the threats posed by North Korea. I agree that it is too simplistic to think that, well, North Korea conducted missile tests and just several days after that, South Korea tested SLBMs in response and that kind of stuff. I don't really think that what we are seeing today is sort of an arms race in this very clear tit for tat fashion. And I also agree that broader national security interests are driving South Korea's military buildup. And we shouldn't think of the inter-Korean dynamic in isolation. I think that there are quite many factors that are driving South Korea's military buildup. I wrote that piece that Markus mentioned earlier, where I argued that wartime OPCON transfer is driving military buildup, but that's really not the only factor. For example, some of the strategic assets that South Korea is developing today cannot be explained by that factor. For example, aircraft carrier, for example, I don't know why South Korea is developing that actually. So they are really expensive. And I don't think that they add too much for South Korea's security. Nuclear power submarines also, they are very expensive and that the US is against South Korea building it. And so I argued in another paper that South Korea may be pursuing nuclear hedging, sort of a hedging option by pursuing nuclear power submarines. And economic drivers are an also important factor. Maybe South Korea is not generating too much money now by selling exports, but I think that in the long term, that's South Korea's goal. And so there are several factors. But really, I want to focus on your argument that maybe that these other factors that you mentioned are more important than this threats posed by North Korea. Although I agree that there are other important factors that are driving South Korea's military buildup, but I wouldn't downplay the importance of this arms race that is going on. And I like to take this opportunity to just talk a little bit about some issues, this sort of a dynamic that I'm thinking about these days, which is what I call sort of double asymmetry. So there's an asymmetry of power on the Korean Peninsula at the both nuclear and the conventional level. Of course, at the nuclear level, North Korea has nuclear weapons, but South Korea doesn't. But at the conventional level, South Korea has far superior military capabilities. And so because South Korea doesn't have a nuclear option, South Korea is trying to deter North Korea with conventional capabilities. And North Korea, on its part, is seeking to enhance its conventional capabilities as well, because nuclear weapons do not eliminate all security threats, and conventional capabilities are still important. And but North Korea's conventional capabilities significantly lag behind those of South Korea. So this power imbalance at the both nuclear and then conventional level, and then the difficulty in assessing power balance across the conventional and nuclear domains are driving an arms race, in my opinion. So South Korea cannot be confident that its conventional capabilities are enough to deter North Korea's nuclear threats, and it's continuing its military buildup. And North Korea is countering that with nuclear and conventional military capabilities, enhancement of those capabilities. So lastly, so what I'm saying is that, what is going on between the two countries is a very important factor. And I understand that the authors don't say that they are, this is not an important factor, but I think that's still driving South Korea's military buildup in a significant way. But lastly, I cannot agree more that South Korea should better coordinate with the United States when planning capabilities development to enhance the alliance's joint warfighting capabilities in an efficient way, avoiding redundancy. For example, the aircraft carriers and nuclear power submarines don't really add much to the joint warfighting capabilities. But as Axel mentioned, I'm also optimistic that South Korea will head in that direction. President Yoon also has already mentioned that he will not pursue nuclear power submarines, and he strongly emphasizes the U.S. ROK alliance in general, and then he's also interested in providing global common goods and countering China. So I think that we are at an inflection point where China is posing a great threat not only to the United States but also to South Korea, and South Koreans are increasingly worried about China's claims to, like kimchi, to Hamburg, and so that's significant because some see that as China's efforts to carve out its sphere of influence on the Korean Peninsula and beyond, in East Asia in general. Okay, well, I'll stop here, but I just once again like to mention that I really enjoyed reading this paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Lami. I know Axel and Markus will definitely want to respond to many of your excellent points, including on China and North Korea. But before they get the opportunity to do that, just want to remind our viewers, if you have a question, please type it in the comment section. I see we have a few in there already, and we'll get to those shortly. But Axel and Markus, do you all have thoughts on what Lami has shared with us?
If I could start off, a lot of really great stuff in there. I'll offer a few key points, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Garlauskas to follow up. First, I'd like to bring up two, I think, really interesting statistics that add a lot to the conversation that we've had today. And I believe actually you worked on the first one. There was a Chicago Council report that came out that found really robust support in South Korea for the development of indigenous nuclear weapons. And so seeing, like we talked about, domestic political drivers and the effect of those drivers on ROK military acquisitions. So seeing how that public support translates and changes over time and what sort of pressure it puts on the Yoon administration and successive administrations will be really interesting to see. And then secondly, exactly as you said, that South Korean views of China in recent years have really plummeted. I think a sort of inflection point that's been mentioned quite a bit was the 2017 THAAD incident. And one of the interesting things about South Korea acquiring and developing military technology is that sometimes I would suspect that South Koreans might see some of these systems as being a way of avoiding future THAAD incidents, that instead of buying a pre-made US system, that by developing an indigenous system and deploying it, it could perhaps meet a military need without causing economic retaliation from China. So seeing how the Yoon administration navigates that and also how future administrations navigate that will be really interesting to see. But I'll stop there. And Mr. Garlauskas, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, and so great points, Axel. And let me just step back to sort of the bigger picture. I mean, first, Dr. Kim, just great comments. And I guess it shows how much there's complexity to these issues, right? Is it you can sort of have very different angles on the discussion and still, I think, be in very broad agreement, right? These things are a lot more complicated than they look at first. But I wanted to zero in on something you said that was a little bit outside the scope of our paper, but I thought was a brilliant insight. Is your comment on the dual asymmetry situation on the Korean Peninsula? I mean, I do think that's a key factor in this whole question. Could be a whole paper in itself, and maybe Dr. Kim, you should be the one to lead the analysis on this one. Is how this challenge of using conventional capabilities to sort of make up for concerns about the U.S. extended deterrence, so the ROK can unilaterally deter actions by North Korea, where it can't necessarily be confident the U.S. extended deterrence is going to be able to deal with the situation, or at least a level of confidence that Seoul would like to have. And it's a tough challenge, right? How do you leverage conventional capabilities to make up for the fact that you don't have nuclear weapons, right? I mean, that's a really good point, and I think we do see it a lot in the policy and in the messaging. The part I'm wondering is how much is it actually affecting the decisions on whether to develop one capability or develop another, as opposed to how to apply those capabilities. And particularly, I see this in the missile force, right? Is that so many of the missile capabilities, frankly, are so beyond the range of North Korea, right? And so having missiles that can hit targets throughout the region, they can still hit North Korea, of course, right? And you could leverage those as part of your conventional approach to deterring North Korea, but whether or not they're actually the driver of developing that particular weapon system, for example, I think that was where our focus was. But I think this whole aspect of the dual asymmetries, I find it fascinating. I think is really interesting observation, and I look forward to hearing and seeing more from you on that, Dr. Kim. I think it's something that really deserves more examination, more airtime. So I look forward to hearing more about that.
Sounds like we have a new paper for next year, Lami, if you're interested. Like I said, we have a few questions from the audience. Before that, I kind of wanted to ask some of my own, Markus and Axel, and let me feel free to jump in if you have thoughts on anything here. But I want to take sort of a look behind and then a look ahead. And in reading your paper, we were going back and forth in the editing process, and you had talked about costs a few times, but I never had made the connection. But hearing you say that, I kind of wanted to ask some of my own. Saying it out loud, it made me think, cost alliance, and it made me think of the previous administration in Washington, as that was a huge source of contention in the alliance. Is there anything to the Trump administration's fear of abandonment by the United States raised by the Trump administration that could be driving the South Korean government to develop its own conventional force a bit more robustly than it was thinking about doing it before?
I could start off with that. Great question. I think looking at Washington's impact, that what the Trump administration and its management of the ROK-US alliance did do is it reminded South Korea that domestic politics in the United States always have the potential of affecting the alliance. That just as domestic politics can affect ROK military acquisitions, that same thing goes for the United States. And then I think what this has also done is that the United States has unintentionally or intentionally fueled the ROK's desire to be more independent, in the sense that it has more independent capabilities and is capable of taking on a greater share of its own defense requirements. And so whether that's in a progressive administration or conservative administration changes a little bit how that looks, but I think the Trump administration has had an impact in that sense.
Great. Markus, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I thought it was Axel's points were excellent. I think more broadly, though, that it is indicative of this larger trend of there's always going to be concerns about U.S. retrenchment and then the potential for the U.S. to be overextended, and I think, regardless of party or personality, I think this whole question of how much allies are contributing and how much the U.S. is going to be able to commit to any particular situation, I think that's going to increasingly come to the forefront in the context of U.S.-China strategic competition, right? This push and pull, I think. Obviously the intensity of those concerns during the period of the Trump administration were much greater than they'd been probably than since the Carter period. But also I think the polling data, and I'd be interested if anyone knows the numbers off the top of my head, indicated probably a larger degree of confidence in the overall state of the alliance and the trajectory of the alliance than it might have seemed like at the time, right? Because the alliance is about a lot more than who pays what, or how many troops there are on the Korean Peninsula of the U.S. at any given time. And so I think on one hand, there's actually probably a surprising degree of resilience and confidence over the arc of the history of the alliance. But I think there is definitely, regardless of who's in office or who will be in office, after the next presidential election, there is going to be this enduring concern about the U.S. military presence is not going to increase over time. It's going to decrease, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But I think that's really important context here, and it was just the intensity of the on this particular issue brought up by the way in which in which President Trump approached it, and the way the administration handled some of these issues. I think did sort of bring it to the forefront more. But I think that's been a trend for a long time.
Thank you both for those great points. The next question I'd like to ask before heading into some of the questions from the audience is that in your paper, you present these recommendations, and you briefly mentioned them in your presentation as well. But we didn't really get a lot of much chance to talk about what sort of tangible outcomes we might expect from directly coordinating on force buildup, on potential contingencies beyond the peninsula. So what sort of things could transparency and cooperation in terms of interoperability get us in the alliance? Do you have any thoughts in mind about what sort of, do you have any ideas, any contingencies that you're thinking about, particularly how direct coordination could help more so than hiding under the umbrella of saying we're building up force development based on North Korea? Is there what sort of shift tangibly could we expect in the alliance?
Yeah, so I think there's two different things going on here. I mean, I want to hit on the interoperability question first, because actually it matters for every contingency, including North Korea, right? And I think this whole problem of how do we as an alliance work together to maximize interoperability, and it's not purely just on the ROK side, right? I think there's some U.S. aspects of this in that interoperability probably needs to be a higher priority for U.S. force development than it is, to be frank, than it is now, because there's a tendency of the U.S. to want to advance the technological, level of capabilities, and then as a result, the equipment is too new then to be backward interoperable sometimes with systems that the allies have, right? So I think the interoperability issue probably is one of the least understood in comparison to its importance, and I think it's one that often is dismissed, is not really significant. Is when you talk to the logisticians, when you talk to operators, the technical need for interoperability and the value of it when you're trying to work together, whether it's dealing with North Korea or dealing with stability operations or whatever, it makes a big difference. And NATO has made interoperability such a priority, right? And I don't think you see that unfortunately that same level of priority in terms of how the ROK and US coordinate their defense acquisitions. So that's one issue set. But I think in terms of the tangible value of more planning, more preparation, more exercises on things other than dealing with North Korea, I think it will bear the most fruit in the near term in terms of ensuring that China has thought carefully about what the costs and risks might be of trying to flex its muscle in a Korean Peninsula contingency or to try and intimidate the ROK. I think if China comes to realize that efforts like the economic bullying they did because of the THAAD deployment, and the backing, essentially the tacit backing that they've been giving North Korea in a whole range of circumstances, if Beijing comes to realize that this is only going to further drive the alliance into a direction where it's going to more closely coordinate, even on a military level regarding China issues, this might help moderate China's coercive behavior and help it to rethink how much support it's going to give, how much backing it's going to give to North Korea. I think that that is a place where it could bear fruit immediately. Over the longer term, I think, and I know this is going to be sensitive, but I think we have to face the idea that a Chinese attack on Taiwan is going to have tremendous implications for the entire region, including South Korea. And at the end of the day, whether South Korea is directly involved in a conflict that follows, or whether South Korea has to protect itself with the U.S. help against North Korean opportunism in such a scenario. Either way, thinking through how the U.S. ROK alliance works militarily, when there is a U.S.-China war going on potentially over Taiwan, I think it's absolutely key, and it's key to do it in such a way where it's not completely hidden from view, to make it more clear, that this is something where it's not a point of vulnerability for the alliance. It's a point of strength. It's a point of growth. It's a point of development. And that would be sort of the more longer term payoff that could actually help prevent a U.S.-China war, right? And I think worst case, a simultaneous war with both China and North Korea at the same time, right? Which would be even more problematic. So I think it helps reinforce deterrence and stability over the long term. If there's no perception of sort of a gap or a rift in the alliance over issues beyond just how to deal with North Korea.
Those are a number of really compelling points. Thank you for those. Getting to the audience question, we actually have one on interoperability right now, asking, do you prefer if South Korea procured U.S. systems, or should South Korea follow, for example, Nato standards when it develops its own weapons? What should be the ideal solution in terms of interoperability?
Since I feel so strongly on this one, I'll go ahead and go first. But I welcome my colleagues here to jump in. I think I'm personally agnostic, right? I think as long as the systems are interoperable and it makes sense operationally, whether the ROK develops its own system or purchases a U.S. system, I think either solution can work. I think it's a case-by-case basis, and it should be thought through in terms of the costs, the other benefits, and what it's going to mean operationally vis-a-vis North Korea, vis-a-vis other threats, and these sorts of things. And sometimes the cost is a big factor, right? Is that sometimes it costs more to produce it domestically, and sometimes, frankly, it costs more to buy the U.S. thing, right? Because the U.S. has some aspect or some requirement that maybe the ROK doesn't need, right? So my preference would be to make sure that interoperability is very high on the list of priorities every time that there is an ROK decision about whether to develop something domestically, to purchase a U.S. system, or frankly to purchase a system from another country that actually meets the same interoperability standard. And I think it's unfortunate that again we don't have that same sort of emphasis in the ROK-US alliances as it seems to what I've seen, and I've never served at NATO, so I'm just speaking based on what I know from a distance, that the emphasis on interoperability in NATO being so very high from the get-go. I'm not saying that the ROK has to adopt NATO standards, or there are other solutions potentially, but at the end of the day, I am completely agnostic to whether or not the ROK develops domestically or buys US. I think it's a decision that should be made on a case-by-case basis, given the individual system, the budget available to the ROK, and a whole bunch of other variables, and some of which we talked about in the presentation. Thanks.
If I could just add to that, I think this question is great, and the questions that Mr. Garlauskas just brought up in terms of what does a specific acquisition mean operationally, and what does it mean vis-a-vis North Korea, and these other questions, that the answer to those questions comes through that transparency and dialogue that we recommend in our paper. And so figuring that out will come through this recommendation. And one thing I would note on top of that, since NATO has been brought up, Poland's Minister of National Defense just visited South Korea, and he met with Minister Eun Ho Kang, the chief of the Defense Acquisition Program Administration, and several South Korean defense industry leaders. And one thing I thought that was key to that was he described how, I think the example he gave was South Korean K2 tanks and US Abrams tanks are interoperable, and that he saw that as a huge benefit of South Korean military development and acquisition. So that would be something I'd point out, that NATO members and such are taking notice of this interoperability question.
Thank you both. The next question we have is also sort of NATO related. In May, South Korea joined the NATO's Estonia-based Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. How important is cybersecurity in regards to cooperation of US, NATO, and ROK?
Go ahead.
I'll go ahead and jump in on this. I think it's key. And I think we didn't focus on it much in the paper because the physical acquisitions are not really the central element, right? It's developing, the human factor, and then the software, and also, frankly, some things that are sort of less transparent, for reasons of security in terms of how you talk about these sorts of programs. But the basic idea of cooperation between the ROK and the US and between the ROK and NATO is key, because cyber is such a it's an issue that transcends national borders, right? As a North Korean actor can conduct a cyber attack from Europe, an actor can conduct a cyber attack which then has spillover effects beyond the target. And we've seen that from North Korea, use of malware, where many countries were affected by their use of malware beyond the original target country, and so I think the more cooperation there is on cyber defense issues among all of these like-minded countries that are in some way part of an alliance with the United States, among these the democracies that believe in for lack of a better term, the rules-based order, right? That could be targeted by North Korean cyber actors, Chinese cyber actors, Russian cyber actors, in some combination. I think it's vital, and it's something that again deserves probably its whole additional line of analysis. But I think this was a real step forward for in that process, and I think also, frankly, the ROK-US alliance, and I've recommended in a previous paper, needs its own cyber center of excellence, either in partnership with NATO or attached to that one, or a separate institution that has some kind of working relationship, because I think it is a area where the alliance is going to come under increasing threat and pressure from North Korea. And I think it's a place, frankly, where we often underestimate North Korea's capabilities and what it can bring to bear, and what it does bring to bear every day in terms of the illicit activities and espionage. The cyber war with North Korea is going on every day, right? It's going on all over the world. But it doesn't get as much attention as when North Korea tests a nuke or these sorts of things. But it's going on, and I think that coordination beyond the Korean Peninsula, is really key on dealing with North Korea cyber threat. Thanks.
Yeah, I would just point to the joint statement that was just released. There's a huge section on U.S.-Korea cooperation on cyber defense and on addressing cybercrime, and so I think that speaks to the importance of the issue going forward, and hopefully multilaterally as well.
All good points. And I want to shift gears a little bit to another important question that we didn't really have time to discuss in full detail. Someone asked, what about OPCON? The term hasn't come up. How's it going, and how is it going to work?
Well, actually, I think this would be also a great place. Dr. Kim, we haven't had any questions directed to you. If you wanted to go first, or I'll make some comments and you can go next. Either way. What do you think, Dr. Kim?
Yeah, sure. Well, as many of you probably know, President Moon was really interested in early transition of wartime OPCON, but President Yoon, the new president, is not too interested. So I don't really think that that's going to happen anytime soon. And also this condition-based OPCON transfer. Those conditions are very hard to meet because, South Korea has to have capabilities to deter North Korea's threats. But not only that, the situation has to be ripe. There has to be, peace and security in the Korean Peninsula. And I don't really think that we will get there anytime soon.
Yeah, I agree with those comments by Dr. Kim, and I'd add that at the end of the day, military officers and defense leaders in the two countries can work together on setting the conditions in terms of progress toward developing capabilities and fielding of those capabilities and training exercises. But the decision to change how the wartime operational control is exercised is ultimately going to be a political decision, right? And I think it's also key to keep in a context that the level and type of that transition has fundamentally changed from what it was originally sort of pitched and envisioned, or maybe originally is not the right term, but at least what it was pitched and envisioned under the period when you had General Bell as the commander of USFK, and you had Secretary Rumsfeld really pushing probably as much from the U.S. side as you saw from Korean counterparts, right? And so that back then was envisioned as a supporting the supported command relationship, where there would be a ROK warfighting headquarters supported by a U.S. warfighting headquarters called CORCOM, and so it was really very separate command structures, but aligned toward the same overall goal of defense and deterrence. Then over time, you had this thinking evolve and the realization that, hey, having a combined ROK US headquarters has a lot of benefits that we don't want to lose. And so now, it kind of gets lost sometimes in the discussion, but it's very clear and open right now that the plan is to keep some sort of a combined headquarters, but have a ROK 4-star officer in charge of that headquarters with a U.S. 4-star as the deputy. So not a fundamental sort of separation, but just a change in who is the commander, who ultimately is going to be responsible to the alliance structures, the military committee, the security consultative meeting, and then ultimately to two presidents, right? As the guidance comes down. And so I think that is a factor that I think is underestimated in how these OPCON discussions play out. Is that as long as you're not talking about an end to the combined headquarters, on one hand, that means that maybe the bar is technically a little bit lower for what has to be ready to do OPCON transition, but on the other hand, it also means the political, significance and centrality of it is not directly tied to, hey, this is like a complete separation between the ROK and U.S. Military structures, or a dramatic separation. And so I think it ultimately comes down to a judgment call between the two governments. And I think Dr. Kim is spot on in that I don't think this is as much of a priority for the Yoon administration, because I don't think there's the same level of sensitivity in the Yoon administration about the optics of having a U.S. 4-star in command of the combined defense, and there's some advantages, right, in terms of deterrence, right, and in terms of showing that there's a tight relationship with the U.S. and the U.S. is not going to withdraw its forces, say, after OPCON transition. So I think the political element here, as Dr. Kim alluded, and the larger strategic environment really plays a big role. And I think the military commanders, at multiple echelons and staff officers would like to focus on the COT-P, on those specific military requirements. But I think, at the end of the day, that the regional context and the domestic political context, and the views of the two presidential administrations involved end up really having a much larger role, probably than and a little bit of a different role maybe than is popularly believed. So I'll leave it at that. This is another one of those topics we could have an entire paper and discussion just on OPCON transition and how it's going. But I think, again, on the military side, there's a lot of progress toward developing capabilities and these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a political decision.
So we've had a very comprehensive discussion on OPCON. So I don't know, Axel, if you wanted to add on that. I kind of want to give you the opportunity, though, to answer this last question that we have here in the short amount of time that we have left, because I think it's a really important one. The person asks, if we're trying to keep China from joining Russia and North Korea in a new bloc, is this the time to be signaling that the U.S. ROK alliance is aimed at China as well as North Korea? Would China ever really believe that the term beyond North Korea meant anything other than China? So is this the right time to be signaling the signals that you all are recommending?
Well, I don't know if I could give a short one word yes or no answer to that, but what I will say is regarding I guess sort of the elephant in the room has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is not addressed in our paper because it's frankly so recent. But I would put forth that Russia's invasion is probably going to bolster, if not expand, the drivers that we've identified in this paper. And that second, specific to the Yoon administration, that one of the takeaways for the Yoon administration from Russia's invasion was that South Korea needs to have strong alliances. And so the Yoon administration is going to look to do that with the United States. Whether, to answer the question, whether this is the right time to expand that, we'll see.
Markus or Lami, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we underestimate how much the factors that are driving North Korea and China together transcend any considerations of the state of the ROK-U.S. alliance. I think as long as U.S. forces are based in South Korea, the Chinese are always going to have the concern, right, about what is going to happen, in the event of a larger confrontation. And so I think it's time to be a little bit more transparent, and rather than doing things that just feed Chinese fears on one hand, but don't actually move the ball. It's kind of, I think we're in a situation where we kind of have the worst of both worlds. But as I wrap up here, though, I want to say I thought this was a really great discussion, and I'm glad to see Dr. Kim, Professor Kim, is teaching a rising generation of national security scholars, military personnel at the Army War College who are going to be key leaders moving forward. People like Axel, who I'm sure will be going into government service someday here in the United States, and so it's just great to see this sort of conversation. Gives me great optimism about our future thinking about Korea's security issues.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's been a wonderful conversation, and that we have two very prominent up and coming scholars and experts on Korea in for this conversation makes it all the better. And it's the extra cherry on top is now that we have Lami on for an extra couple of papers. I feel like since we've had that discussion, we'll have to have you back certainly. But I wanted to again thank you all for a great conversation. And encourage everyone listening in to, again, check out the paper. Thank you all for joining.